The gaming industry is eating itself, Josh Brown. There are a few different things I want to touch on here, but mainly this talking point is inspired, quote unquote, by Bungie announcing that they're laying off 220 employees, affecting various community teams and other specific teams within Bungie themselves. Some staff have been reassigned to Sony, SIE, Sony Interactive Entertainment, while others have been let go entirely, taking to social media to talk about the reality of how sudden all that stuff was. And also to flag the fact that Bungie CEO Pete Parsons has spent over $2.5 million on vintage cars across the last couple of years, which he was apparently inviting employees to go see almost up to 2 days before the layoffs, which is pure peak CEO BS, and I guess nothing new, but it is ridiculous. Alongside that, we have known industry insider Jeff Grubb saying that as far as he knows, Herman Hulst is now running Bungie, Herman Hulst being the dude or one of two people who replaced Jim Ryan at the top of Sony. Grubb saying that they attempted to soften the blow by sending many people from Bungie into SIE instead of cutting them. Grubb thinks that the number of jobs lost, he thought the number of jobs lost was going to be closer to 350, and in time Bungie will lose its autonomy and become just like any other PlayStation worldwide studio under SIE and Herman Hulst. This is a process that is starting now, but it is happening. There's a lot of stuff I want to get to about what this means for the industry. I'm nowhere near done talking about how much this made me think about how unhealthy the industry is, and I'll get there. But immediate thoughts on all the state of Bungie stuff.
Sony's acquisition of Bungie in the near future has got to go down as one of the weirdest, if not worst, acquisitions in recent memory, right?
Like that and Embracer, just messing everything up.
At least, I don't know, Embracer had an idea. You know, they didn't implement it well. If a deal falls through, it shouldn't lead to that idea imploding. That's definitely on them. But I don't know, personally, I can't wrap my head around what Sony's plan for Bungie even was. No. I know it was to get their help on their own live service games, but why spend that amount of money to bring them in-house, but also keep them independent, to essentially use them as a consultancy firm, only to end up in a situation where that initially promised independence is now being reneged on because Bungie seemingly is run by a bunch of chaos merchants who just can't keep any project on track or can't do justice to this iconic studio. And I do blame the likes of Pete Parsons at this point, because the one common denominator between Bungie's different eras is Bungie themselves messing up. Like, initially we thought, okay, maybe it was Microsoft mismanaging them. They go independent. They signed a deal with Activision, sorry. Or Activision, obviously Activision are bad. It's their reason why they eventually had to go independent. Then Bungie is independent and they signed with Sony, and all of these layoffs, all of this news, all of these missed targets continue to happen. And it's like, there's something exponentially wrong at the top of that studio, surely. Yes. How can those executives keep avoiding responsibility and having the responsibility fall on the senior workers, which, from what I've read anyway, seems to be the brunt of the developers who have actually been hit for seemingly decisions and studio structures that weren't their idea to begin with.
There's a fascinating series of tweets from now ex-community manager Liana Rupert, who used to work for Bungie, just talking about she says that it'll all come out in a good few years, but this is a problem with the executives that goes back multiple decades, that goes back to the 90s. And there were all sorts of stories, even around Halo's development, and obviously the quality of Halo gets in front of those stories. It's not, obviously a lot of us are blinded to the reality of the way Bungie works, either from a lack of, internal reporting, or just the fact that Halo was so good that it was like, well, it's Halo, it's a Halo trilogy, go look at that, that's how awesome that is. But there's like I said, a series of tweets from Rupert just saying that the problem is from the top down, it is from the executive level, it goes back decades and decades, and there is that, story around the way that Halo 2 was put together, and that was literally the case of just crunching, working extreme overtime because of how badly planned that whole thing was. And yes, Halo 2 was still phenomenal. It's a testament to the art departments, the coding departments that brought it all together. But it seems like Bungie has always had a bit of a rotten head for a while. And I mentioned the thing with the cars as just a way of highlighting potentially where priorities were or were not. Do whatever you want with your own money. But at the same time, I think it's worth highlighting the potential incoming reports that may or may not happen in regarding to someone like Pete Parsons and the way that Bungie's been run across the last few years. We can also fold in, because it is part of this particular part of this discussion, the fact that Bungie were recruited to be this internal review board for various other live service projects that were happening at Sony, resulting in the cancellation of the Last of Us factions, and the revival of Twisted Metal apparently being stopped according to Jason Schreier, but nothing officially has been mentioned about that. But internally, Sony appointed Bungie to check out all these different projects they had in the works, and for whatever reason, the members of Bungie that were a part of that said that none of these projects were coming together, whatever.
Yeah.
But at the same time, Bungie's own numbers were failing. Destiny was failing, etc. I want to get to another point in a bit, but
so many good points there, Scott Shelby. So much to talk about.
The vibes are so off.
They are, man. The aura is very bad around this Pete Parsons guy in particular. You mentioned that thing with the cars there, and yeah, okay, multi-million-dollar CEO shows off his car collection, spends a lot of money. Fair enough, but it's not just the optics of that. It's a kind of a pattern of behavior we've seen so many times before, where you're told that, if you work for these companies that you're valued. I saw a lot of different employees who were laid off yesterday talking about how, as recent as just a month ago or whatever it was, they were told how valuable they are and how much of an asset they are to the company and how safe they were with their seniority within the company and how they couldn't lose them. And then now they just kind of get, kicked out. And, you get the likes of CEOs showing off their wealth and their car collections, and then 2 days later announcing layoffs. We saw, for instance, I've already forgot his name, Jim Ryan, the former CEO of PlayStation, visiting studios and taking pictures with developers to only announce that they were doing mass layoffs at those studios or closing them down entirely, and just kind of putting up this front of everything's okay, guys, we're all a family here. I'm your friend. No, I'm not. Go away. I couldn't care, because all I care about is the money or the bottom line of this. And that kind of just lack of humanity to these layoffs I always find really alarming, because again, a lot of reports from people who were laid off were saying the first they heard of it was when the press release went out. They didn't have any prior warning, they didn't have any meetings or anything. It was just, do I even have a job now? I don't know. The communication has not been there. And that's just kind of one part of it that really gets me irate. I know there's a big difference between UK labor laws and US labor laws, where this kind of suddenness is more the norm in the US, but it's still, to me, in a studio as big as Bungie, that is, I know it's been in the red, that's what they describe in the actual press release, but it's not the developers' fault who are making these games. It's the people who implemented these structures, and they get to say for like the 5th time, "Oh, my bad, guys, we need to restructure," and it's you who eats crap on this. Yeah, which like I said, has happened many times before, especially across this year, which is what I want to get to. I think there's a conversation to be had about the literal health of the gaming industry. Things like the Jim Ryan situation, the Pete Parsons situation, the fact that, like, if you've given the biggest benefit of the doubt possible on the planet that they didn't know what was going to happen 2 days prior to the layoffs, possibly, I doubt it. But if that is the case, then that would point to what I'm going to get to anyway, which is like I said, the unhealthy nature of the industry, and the fact that someone maybe doesn't know what's about to happen 2 days time from a lack of communication or financials or whatever. Before we move on to that bit, can I just throw you one question as well? Because you mentioned the Jeff Grubb comment that, the initial promise with Bungie when they were acquired by Sony was that they were going to maintain a level of independence. It was going to be like similar to when Microsoft has bought Activision or Bethesda. It's like Microsoft and then Activision and then Bethesda. It was always PlayStation and then Bungie. They were kind of this, like 2 different spheres of Sony as a whole. And obviously that has kind of been chipped away as the years have gone on. And what do you think about the idea of, one, Bungie being spun off to have some of its workers now be a part of a proper PlayStation internal studio, and the potential reality that going forward in a few years' time, Bungie does just become one of those internal studios that we talk about alongside the likes of Sucker Punch or Naughty Dog? Because I don't know, man, I don't want to put too much faith in another leadership team that has made mistakes, big mistakes this year in terms of layoffs and over-promising and not coordinating their teams, but I don't know, like, surely, I don't know, is that healthier for Bungie? Is that better for Sony? It just kind of seems crazy that a iconic, huge, independent studio with such an authorial stamp could just become, I don't mean this to sound derogatory, but another Sony studio. No, I know. Well, my thing is that the acquisitional side of it, it's always advertised as being extremely healthy, because here's your paycheck. It's potentially a blank paycheck. Go make your dream game. Don't worry about it. And then, as we've literally seen over and over again, one of the most recent examples being all the Hi-Fi Rush stuff that happened under Xbox, those numbers need to make sense eventually. Like, the acquisition stuff sounds good. It sounds good for the shareholders. But the final products quote unquote, need to be there. However, those goals change. Those goalposts change so much when
you're more responsible for a bigger number at the end of the month. I feel like that is the ongoing thing that's happening at the minute. I remember when Double Fine were acquired by Xbox, when they were going to put Psychonauts 2 on Game Pass, and it's part of the whole Psych Odyssey behind the scenes documentary that's over on YouTube, which I recommend to everybody all the time because it's phenomenal. It shows every facet of what it's like working on a video game, being acquired in real time, and you have members of that team saying like, yeah, we're all smiles right now, and the Matt Booty from Xbox is all smiles right now, but the dude from finance isn't even here, and when he gets a view on how much money we need to make to be sustainable, that's going to be a problem. And then that literally was the case for Hi-Fi Rush and everything else. So for me, we've seen this twice over now. We saw Sony say that nothing's going to affect Bungie even after the acquisition. Then we had the layoffs, and we also had Xbox say nothing's going to change in regards to, and Phil Spencer say nothing's going to change in regards to acquiring different studios. And then Hi-Fi Rush, Tango Gameworks gets shut down, even though they were BAFTA award-winning developers. So it's just a horrible reality of acquisitional stuff and making a company that big, where an entity that big and that lumbering still needs to move forward, but it sheds everything on the way to try and maintain that momentum.
It is interesting, I think, that Sony has this relationship with Bungie. They literally own Bungie at this point after they have pivoted from the Jim Ryan mandate of get us so many live service games in production. You know, you mentioned Bungie allegedly having not final say, but a major sway on how in development games like Last of Us Factions were being made and whether they were viable or not. I mean, I've said it so many times that I feel like a broken record, but that always felt crazy to me because, yeah, of course, you cannot doubt that Bungie themselves have been instrumental in even defining what a live service AAA game is, in blending the idea of, you know, single player with multiplayer and having these huge content drops. But especially when they were apparently making these decisions, they weren't in good stead with their own fandom. No. They weren't even doing what the fandom was responding to. They were losing players. They even admitted last year when they did the first round of layoffs that they were losing the trust of players and that they would do better by them. So to me, I understand why Sony would be looking at them as the absolute pinnacle of live service, but I guess this is pure speculative from me, but what advice were they giving teams? I always said, you know, I would personally, and maybe the studio didn't want to do this at all, maybe they do prefer to make single player games. I would have preferred to see what Naughty Dog's take on a live service game would have been, rather than what Bungie's take on a Last of Us live service game would have been. And it seemed like that was the reason that they were kind of even bought in the first place.
Yeah, I forget who did the initial insider report on this, on the whole Bungie, reporting on the live service project stuff. I think it was a Jason Schreier piece. It would have been a Bloomberg piece. But apparently the reason given for Last of Us Faction shutting down was from the Bungie review board side. They didn't think there was enough monetizable content in The Last of Us, enough repeats, like whether that's objectives or unlocks or whatever it is. To me, go look at the roguelike mode that was plugged into Last of Us 2's re-release as an example of what a repeat Last of Us experience looks like. I maintain that thing is the scraps of what would have been Factions. I think the same for God of War Ragnarok's Valhalla expansion as well. I think that's a God of War repeat business thing that was just pulled the plug on when they knew it wasn't going to work anymore. But all of this is part of that wider conversation on, and you just mentioned the idea that Bungie themselves were talking about doing right by the fans. The thing I really wanted to talk about is and alongside all of this, when we talk about the health of the industry, is the viability for new video games, like good gameplay ideas, or just ideas that aren't the most expected thing possible to sustain, and the idea that quality just does not matter right now, because you can have the best, well-received game ever in the industry, and you'll still be laid off. And this comes from Bungie as well, because in regards to, like you said, them trying to do right by the fans, Destiny 2's most recent expansion, which is potentially now their final expansion, the final shape, went down as the best thing they've done in years. Straight 10 out of 10 reviews, 5 stars, must play, etc. I personally think they dropped the ball on marketing because I feel like there was a bit of word of mouth, but not much. But still, the quality was there. And like I mentioned, across the last 10, 15 minutes or so, that goes alongside, award-winning Hi-Fi Rush developer Tango Gameworks. They suffered layoffs a year after Hi-Fi Rush, even though the game was one of the tips of the spear coming to PlayStation, as this is what an Xbox exclusive can be. Look at this quality, and then they laid them off. And then there's string of titles across the last month or two that released, had bad sales, and were immediately laid off. Alone in the Dark's reboot, developer Pieces Interactive, they shut down 3 months after bad sales of the game in June. Immortals of Avium developer Ascendant Studios lost half their workforce a month after the game's released at the end of last year. Arcane Austin with Redfall, Daedalic Entertainment with Lord of the Rings Gollum. Obviously, quality is not there, but we're still talking about sales and the immediacy of shutting people down. Daedalic Entertainment was shut down after Lord of the Rings Gollum. And right now, as we're recording this, there are various reports doing the rounds in regards to Flintlock Siege of Dawn from developers A44, with various write-ups over on their LinkedIn pages showing staff losing their jobs, with the game apparently bombing. And it goes like, I've got even more for this. But the overall attitude here, the overall thing that seems to be emerging is you have to hit huge right now to be remotely sustainable, or your game will not do enough numbers and you will be laid off in an extremely ridiculously painful short amount of time with very little communication. And that will permeate through to the idea of why even bother in the first place? Why even invest in this industry if you're a young person coming up or you have an idea in general? There was always that quote from Satoru Iwata talking about the fact that developers worrying about losing their jobs tomorrow will not make great games today.
Yes.
That's why he gave up a lot of his money back when he was still alive, to help fund the developers and keep Nintendo afloat during the Wii U era. That just needs to come back. The fact that it's not worth investing the extra part of your time making a quality release anyway is insane. Like I said, there's more to this, but good lord.
God, man, there's so much to this, isn't there? I guess I might as well finish off the Bungie thing, because you mentioned there with the latest DLC being of high quality and apparently being, one of the best things that the company has done in a long, long time, especially with Destiny 2. I think for me that's slightly different from the other games that you mentioned, because that release, it was the last thing they released, but it wasn't necessarily in a vacuum. And I think it's a testament to just how hard it is to keep a live service consistent over a long period of time. To me, even though Destiny has, of course, had its huge high points, it's done some really great things, it's had some really great content drops. I'll compare it to something like No Man's Sky, right? Which started off similar to Destiny 1 as this kind of laughing stock, viewed as completely under-delivering on its initial promise. And since then, we've seen Hello Games not only make good on their initial promises and claw back the respective fans, but continue to improve that game. Every new content drop, seemingly for No Man's Sky, is like better than the last, or at least is as good as the last. It constantly adds new good things that are, well received by the community. I'm sure not everyone hits, but it's never this kind of roller coaster that we've had with Destiny since Destiny 1. Destiny 1 comes out, everyone's down on it. The Taken King comes out, we're back up, then we're back down. Then it's the launch of Destiny 2 and we're riding high, then we're back down, and Bungie saying, oh, we're so sorry, we've lost your trust, and then we're back up with the final shape. Like that kind of inconsistency and that lack of trust, I think, especially with live service games and big publishers like Bungie, you can't lose and then regain the trust at such a rapid speed all the time. You need that level of consistency. You need to commit to ideas. You need to commit to the community. Not listen to every single thing they say. Obviously, you need your own artistic vision, but you can't keep flip-flopping. But to move on, unless you want to add something to that.
No, I was just, that's all completely, that's so valid. The only reason I'm mentioning it in regards to these other games is just that idea of a viability of a studio maintaining even when the quality is there.
Yes.
But like you said, there's obviously nuance, there's obviously way more to the Bungie situation overall.
100%. But you are right in the idea that, one not even bad game, one middlingly selling game now can just completely close a studio, and I do feel like that's new. We've always had layoffs, we've always had studio closures even, but it's never felt this cutthroat. It reminds me...
Not within a week of release.
Not in a week of a release.
2 weeks for Flintlock Siege of Dawn.
Man. I know business has always been like this to a certain extent, but it reminds me of the Sopranos thing, where you're only as good as your last paycheck. It doesn't matter about anything else you brought. It doesn't matter how much money you've made in the past. If the last thing you released did not turn a good profit and wasn't what we wanted, we're not even going to give you a chance to
the industry is on the breadline.
Something else. Absolutely. Like you said, it's make or break every single day. It's that idea that developers, even when they're told they're in rock solid positions and they're great at their jobs and they're doing amazing, invaluable work, when they're told that and then they're laid off a few days later, like that's just not a model. And I do think that is, in some ways, it's because expectations are so high, because budgets have gotten so high. But in other ways, I just think it's a lack of belief in a way. It's a lack of belief that these studios could build up to make something great. You know, it kind of reminds me of, I'm going to go on a tangent here. It reminds me of like the DCEU, right? Where it's like we need an Avengers right now. We need to start making $1.5 billion, forgetting that it took Marvel like 4 or 5 movies to get to the point where they were breaking $1 billion. And Iron Man 1 made like a respectable $600 million or whatever it was, $500 million, a couple $100 million for the Incredible Hulk, for Captain America, Thor. And it's like, you need to build these things up. You need to give these teams time, because I'm sure you'll get to this. There's so many games vying for our attention right now. Like Flintock is a game that I really want to get to. I'm excited to play it, but the reality is I'm playing Elden Ring's DLC right now, and I'm going to be preoccupied with that for a good 20 hours more than what I've already put into it. And by the time I get to play this game that I am really looking forward to, that I really want to play, the studio is shut down because it hasn't had the support. And it's like, give people time, allow these games time to grow, allow word of mouth to spread. If they are good, hopefully that will translate to sales, rather than not hitting a target in a specific quarter and going, right, well, we're going to just cut off support for this game, for this team, move on to something else. That failed.
This is almost exactly the problem that I think is metastasizing in real time, which is just the fact that we have a shareholder-based model for the biggest production budgets that are in the industry. We have this idea of trying to please shareholders, try and do the most bankable ideas possible, and having it so that you don't necessarily secure funding in other ways whilst the game is being developed, whether maybe the team is entirely focused on something like Concord or whatever it is. Nice big production, gorgeous visuals, but it then needs to hit at launch. It needs to be this immediate return, because the studio aren't necessarily doing contract work or whatever it is alongside that you might do if you were a smaller independent team. Hello Games were never acquired, and they were able to they thankfully, or whatever you want to say, sold enough off No Man's Sky at the beginning to then be able to keep going and keep doing expansions and make it work over time. But we have this shareholder-based model that is potentially, I don't know enough about it on the business side, like the real meat and potatoes, guts side of it, and I'm waiting for way more information to come out about the reality of which parts of games are changed, which visions are shaped along over time, which features are cut back on, which production schedules are changed, to try and appease shareholders in terms of release dates and everything else. But you have the shareholder side of things, where it's like, we need the biggest games possible over and over and over again. They need to last 100 hours each, etc., etc. There's the push into subscription models, so we're going to give you 5 or 6 of them every month, which, like you just said, genre-wise, there's so much crossover. Like, you want to play a hack and slash game right now, there's Kunotsugami, Dungeons of Hinterberg, there's Elden Ring's DLC, there's Flintlock Siege of Dawn, and that's all from the last 3 weeks, or maybe the last month. It's ridiculous.
And then you got Stellar Blade and Rise of the Road like from earlier this year.
There's all that. So you have the shareholder side of it, the subscription model, the genre crossover. And then, which is the thing I'm going to throw in here, is the idea that there literally are too many games and not enough time and people to actually get to the amount of stuff that's available. To me, and this is the bit where I'm going to go a little bit more hazy, and then I'll drill it back down again. When we think about past generations that we grew up on, like I go all the way back to the Master System because I'm ancient, but I think about everything, PS1, PS2, N64, PlayStation, Xbox 360, whatever. There was a handful of titles. When you think of a certain year or you think of a certain console, a handful of titles rise to the top. The other stuff was there, and it still managed to get an audience, like Vib Ribbon on the PS1 or whatever the hell, Journey on the PlayStation 4. But there were less titles overall, and that's a wider conversation as to something like early access and the amount of different ideas that can get off the ground. That's a great thing in theory, but in terms of the amount of people who are actually available to play the video games, that's what I want to mention. Because when we talk about layoffs, in 2024 we've had over 11,000 people have now lost their jobs. That's an actual thing on a games industry layoff tracker website. It's over 11,000. But when we look at the actual gaming industry data, I want to throw in some stuff from data analyst firm Sakana, who have mentioned over the last few months that subscription services are stalling, and that there literally are too many games for the amount of players and time available. Sakana's Matt Piscatella mentioned when speaking to Kyle Bossman on YouTube that we saw the potential maximum amount of gamers available in the pandemic before that number retracted again, leading to the idea that we've seen how big the industry can be. And right now, obviously, that number retracted, but we still have so many live service projects, big projects in general, still moving forward. I also want to throw in, that wasn't a direct quote from Piscatella either. I'm summarizing his interview, but I would recommend going to watch it. But alongside that, we have PlayStation Plus engagement is down this month. Website True Trophies reported a 50% drop in player numbers for July's games, and across the extra/premium Premium, PlayStation Plus tiers. And we also have Xbox hardware being down. I think it's 42% down on hardware, but their gaming revenue is up 67%, which I think is interesting in regards to how sewn up the market is.
Yeah.
I know I'm going on about a lot of different things here, but if we're talking about the bigger picture of the industry, the idea of too many games, the idea of investing in a certain amount of things and everything that other titles not being able to punch through, look at the top 10. The vast majority of what's in there is GTA Online, Roblox, Call of Duty.
Yes.
It's, EA's college football's punched through and Valorant's on there right now. But 8 out of 10 top 10 games, at least in the UK, are the same titles for the last 5 years. So I do think all that stuff is interesting. I will round it off with Microsoft Chief Financial Officer Amy Hood saying that going forward, Xbox's real goal is to build what looks like a software annuity and subscription business rather than anything based in what came before. And I'm adding that bit at the end. But if we're talking about where the industry is, it's trying to steer into the casual skid and trying to split it, go as casual and wide as possible, and get away from specialized titles.
100%. It's interesting, Scott. I guess to link it back to even what resulted in the layoffs at Bungie is they were spreading themselves too thin across too many games. Like they mentioned in the press release that they had, how many was it? 1,200 employees spread across 3 different titles, and they were just spread too thin, and they were working in the red because they were trying to do too much. They had Marathon that they're working on, they had Destiny that they're working on, and then an unannounced third game that they were working on. They had enough stuff in the oven that they've been able to spin off a new company from within themselves to work on a game that they were working on that's now under Sony, right? It's just so many irons in the fire, trying to do everything at once, trying to not necessarily flood the market, but make sure you've got a lot of releases coming out. And like you mentioned there, like who has the time to play all of that stuff, especially in an era where the most played games or the highest selling games are the biggies that people have been playing for the past 5 years and are invested in, and it's getting tougher and tougher, no matter the quality of the releases, to get people to leave those ecosystems and buy something new en masse. Even as someone who does this for a job, who is incentivized to play as many games as possible, I'm overwhelmed at this moment in time, man. I keep thinking about my games that not only I feel like I need to play, but that I want to play. It's overwhelming. Like I'm playing Elden Ring. I want to play a Flintlock. I want to go back to Nobody Wants to Die. I want to play Tekken 8 from previously, from earlier on in this year.
Prince of Persia's right there, mate.
I want to play Prince of Persia. That's in the sale right now. And at a certain point, you just think, oh man, I want to support, especially like the smaller games, like Nobody Wants to Die, because I want them to get that money. But realistically, like, the industry shouldn't be working on a model where people feel like they have to rush out in the first few weeks to support a game. Otherwise, the developers themselves might go entirely under, especially with how long games are, how many live service games there are, and just the sheer amount of quality releases that we get a year. It's a cutthroat release schedule, I think.
And it's like there's an assumption that if you do get hoovered up by one of the bigger companies, that they are providing that bottom line, and that won't result in immediate layoffs. However, to bring it all the way back to, like I said, when Double Fine were acquired during the Psychonauts 2 development, it is that specific distinction between the forward-facing members of said company, like Xbox, like Sony, like Bungie, whatever, and then the finance departments who do not care. They need to balance the numbers, and if they need the number to be a 2 and it's a 3, then that person worth the 1 is being severed. Like it's getting as comically literal as that, and you're seeing it, like I said, over and over again in real time, to the point where, like you said, it doesn't feel like smaller titles are viable, but we're all getting very sick of the same genre hero shooters, live service stuff over and over and over again. Look at the likes of Concord, how many players that did not have, and that's such a big bet. I mean, Concord was in development before Sony bought Firewalk. Is it Firewalk? I think it's Firewalk. Before they bought them, but at the same time, that game bombed so much, or is bombing, I guess it's in the present tense, that it feels like that will then have a knock-on effect, where the conversation in your average forum thread is, I feel for the devs, or I worry about the devs. The fact that that is the go-to sentiment for an entire industry is insane.
And you know it's the devs. Like, you know it's the devs that's going to take the brunt of it. I know Jim Ryan has left, but it wouldn't be the top executives who decided, oh, we want all of these live service games games, and that's what we're going to bet everything off, and then change our minds when we don't think it's going to work anymore, or we want to pivot into a new direction, or we want to go all in on PSVR, and we're going to get all of these studios to work on VR games, and then when Call of the Mountain doesn't do as well as they want to, perhaps because their own piece of kit they've overcharged for, or at least they haven't gauged the market for, and those games don't perform and they don't sell well, go away. We're not going to give you a chance to do something else. We're not going to give you a chance to make a PlayStation 5 game or whatever it is. Like, just be gone. We want to pretend this didn't happen anymore.
That sort of like cascading down, you're just in a little box, like trying to keep the box, holding the walls and holding the roof up kind of thing. Yeah. Goes even bigger. Like, I forget the name of the member of Xbox. Who said when talking about Xbox marketing and the fact that you hardly ever see Xbox marketing anywhere near as much as Sony.
Oh yeah, they said they were skint, didn't they?
They literally said, Sony has access to funds that we don't, and it's like, well, you're part of a multi-billion-dollar umbrella company. But it's just those funds aren't allocated. Those financial people on the Microsoft side, a lot of people have referred to Xbox within Microsoft as a rounding error in regards to how much money Xbox makes compared to Windows, compared to the wider Microsoft stuff. And so I imagine that they are also in a similar position of trying to make ends meet. But at the end result is an unhealthy feel. The industry does not feel anywhere near as healthy as it did during the 360 or even the PS4 era / Xbox One era. And even that started with so much of a delay because at the time it was thought the consoles were dead and PC was the future, etc. It's just, we're in a horrible place, especially if you're working on the coding side, on the actual development side, where unless you've managed to secure enough independent funding, you can't even rely on the billion-dollar company to be there for you tomorrow.
Dude, man, like the line, and I don't want to get political after we've already gone through all of this, but it's the same with like governments and the idea when they say like the money just isn't there. The money is there, it's just what you're choosing to spend it on. Yes. The same with like these big video game companies. It's your choice to give someone like Bobby Kotick a $500 million golden parachute to leave the company after he's made this deal with Microsoft. Like, there is money there. We know there's money there. You have to do your financials every year to shareholders. We have just seen Microsoft talk about which aspects of their business are up. We've seen Sony say that they've had a great year and still make layoffs like this. Yeah. We know there is money. It's just what you deem to be like profitable. It's what you deem to be the bar that you want to hit. It's what you deem to be worth spending that money on and how much you want to keep. Like, that's fundamentally the issue, because you can't tell me that like making some of these changes in the long run is gonna give you the numbers that you want, because you're going to have to make similarly drastic changes next year, I feel, to get those numbers back up. You mentioned shareholders earlier on, and I know I mentioned this in the podcast last week with you, and I'm still baffled by the shareholder Q&A that Capcom released, where you got an insight into the shareholders and their mentality and how they view games and how they view the workers.
Just released it earlier.
Literally, man. Like, that idea of, hey, this Monster Hunter game you got in development, we're looking at the projections for this year. What if you just released it in December? What if you just
now, if anything?
Just release it now, and then we get the money up, and then solid, right? Like, do you live in space? Have you met a human anymore? Have you even been in a development studio? No, I don't think you have.
Are you an alien, sir?
Stuff like with when we talk about retention, that idea of like you're only as good as your last paycheck, you're only as good as being like your last project. They mentioned there, and again, sorry for repeating this, me and you talked about it last week, but they mentioned Street Fighter 6's DLC team. They were talking about how well Street Fighter 6 sold, but then they were questioning because Capcom hadn't released the profits for the Street Fighter 6 DLC. Right. They were saying, well, can you tell us the profits versus the cost of keeping that team on the DLC and on Street Fighter 6? Can you tell us about the cost of the upkeep? In Capcom, to their credit, in as many words, said in their response, well, we haven't released the profits, but it's about more than profits. Yes. Maintaining this team is one, about doing good by the people who bought into Street Fighter 6 with certain expectations from our messaging, and two, maintaining an element of trust around us as a company and the franchise in getting people to want to play a Street Fighter 7 whenever it comes along next, or a more Street Fighter 6 DLC. Like, yes, profits are of course important, money is of course important, but I feel like so many of these shareholders, so many of these executives prioritize that short-term bump over the impact on these studios and these companies in the long term.
Yeah, well, especially when it comes to Capcom, they are on fire right now in the best way possible. Like, my beloved Kunutsugami Path of the Goddess is one of the coolest things I've ever seen, and there's no way that if their company was ran to the queue or whatever of those shareholders, that it would even exist, because it is a more quirky, off-kilter side game. It's a hack and slash strategy game where you're positioning units and it's blending various different genres and ideas together, and that's not as safe a bet as another hero shooter or whatever. But it's because the likes of Devil May Cry and the likes of Monster Hunter and Resident Evil do so well that they can do a DMC5 and do a Kunutsugami and do a Dragon's Dogma 2. That's a healthy company for right now, and I'm so glad they were able to bat back the shareholders.
Yeah.
Or in that particular instance, that particular individual, saying, well, why not just do the safest bets over and over again? Why not release it earlier? Money, 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 money. Like you said, you need that funding, that financing, if you're going to be living in a shareholder model. And Katsuhiro Harada has mentioned that in regards to Tekken. He's like, if you want to have a long form game, and obviously they're part of Namco, then you need to have these monetizable elements long form. That's part of how the industry is, and I get that. But for it to take over everything, is a massive issue. And yeah, I don't doubt how hilariously, tragically stupid a lot of this is at the top level.
Yes.
The more exposure we get to the way those conversations go, the more I'm like, this is nowhere near as professional or well thought out or intelligent as I thought it was growing up.
You know when you used to hear about success stories, no matter what media you were talking about, like, I don't know, as recent as 10 or 15 years ago, the idea always was that if you make a huge success for a company, that would award you a certain level of leverage to have more creative control and more say over how those profits are spent. Not on a huge business level, but in terms of your own
It should be literal bankability.
I mean, it should be, yeah, but I mean, even then it was kind of only a little bit of leeway, but I feel like that has just completely been eradicated across the board over the past 10 years or so. I'm not the first person to say this, but in movies for the longest time, the most successful directors, or even the smaller scale directors who would make good, profitable movies, would work on a basis of like, okay, one for you and then one for me. Martin Scorsese makes Cape Fear for the studio so he can make The Passion of the Christ.
That's Nolan's thing, right?
Yeah, exactly. It has that sort of like give and take relationship. But now with these studios, it's like one for me, and then another one for me, and then more for me, and actually I would have sacked you now because it's all for me. You don't get that. I don't feel like, and we've seen this with Sony in particular, when they announced that like the only things that they're interested in investing in now are the franchises that they've established. And I just don't think in the current reality things could change that we get something like The Last of Us 1, which was very much like a Neil Druckmann dream game. That studio has proven themselves with the likes of the Uncharted franchise, made huge amounts of money, and then they get to try this other thing. They don't have to do a Jack and Daxter reboot like was initially the goal. They get to make something interesting and new, and then that takes off. Same with Guerrilla Games, they've done their business with Killzone. Now we get to try something else. And we get to pivot and we get to make something new. I just feel like that mentality has really gone away. You talk all the time, rightly so, about Rockstar and how they used to just create so many games across the PS2 and even early 360 era, where you were getting the likes of the Warriors, Bully, Rockstar's Table Tennis. But now the expectations on that company are so high that anything other than a GTA, even a Red Dead Redemption 2, struggles to get, post-launch support for its online mode because it's not doing as good as GTA
Online.
And if you make something like GTA 5, right, this might be controversial, I don't know. Again, there's a big difference between UK business and US business, I think. Might be controversial, but I think if you make something as successful as GTA 5, you get to do what you want.
Yes, you should have a bit of an exhale and be able to go and do something else and not be bolted to GTA Online for the rest of your living life.